All right, so welcome to the course. This is the first lecture in terms of content that we're going to look at. And essentially what I want to do here is review Lewis Vaughn's first chapter, or at least the part of the first chapter that we're studying. And it is called Ethics in the Examined Life. So what he does is he just introduces the general concept of ethics, talks about why it may be important, and he also discusses some elements of ethics. So in terms of, well, what is it? So he defines it as a system that refers to beliefs concerning right and wrong, good and bad, beliefs that include judgments, values, rules, principles, and theories. So boiled down to it, what ethics studies is what is good, what is bad, what is right, and what is wrong. And then it tries to explore why that is the case. And in an ethics course, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to explore various answers to that question. What would make something right? What would make something wrong? What would make something good? What would make something bad? And we want to try to get an answer to that question. And we're doing it within the specific course theme of how much time and energy should I spend on myself versus others. So when we explore different theories that are going to define right and wrong in a certain way, you also want to ask yourself, well, based on that theory, how much time should I spend on myself versus how much time I should spend on others? Does that theory tell me that there's a right or wrong amount of time to spend on myself versus others? And Vaughn also mentions that ethics is really connected with the ancient Socratic question, how ought I to live? Socrates is one of the most important philosophers to have ever lived. In Western philosophy, you could argue he is the most important philosopher. He is the inspiration for Plato, and then Plato's works become the foundation of Western philosophy. And so essentially one of the big things that he really cared about is how am I supposed to live? What is the good life? What is the life that human beings are meant to live and therefore ought to devote themselves to? Ethics is really, and this is something to keep in mind, ethics is really a study of ought. What ought I to do? What ought you to do? And that's what we're going to go into. All right. So Vaughn also talks about, okay, what ethics is about values. What do we value most? What is most important? What is the good that we're going to define and to live our lives by? What goals should we pursue in our life? What goals are legitimate? What goals are illegitimate based on ethics? And what duties should we fulfill or not fulfill? What are the rules that we're supposed to follow? He talks about it, and he wants to kind of bring this to the attention of students. Do ethics really matter? Is this a waste of time? And he talks about this question by raising a number of other questions. And just from your book, page 3, he asks, does it matter whether the state executes a person who is mentally disabled, who maybe has the mental capacity of a 10-year-old, who can only think like a 10-year-old? Is it right or wrong for the state to do that? Does it really matter who writes your term paper? Does it matter whether you cheat in this class? If that's an important question, if that's a worthwhile question, then ethics matters. Answering why it is or is not acceptable is something that ethics is going to be involved in. Do we save a drowning child? He also asks, as opposed to letting that child drown. If that is an important question, well, then that is something that we want to use ethics to study. Okay. So he talks a bit, very, very briefly, about where do ethics come from? What is the source? Is it conscious? Is it society? Is it religion? And then he asks, okay, well, if you assume that ethics comes from your society, your tradition, your religious group, well, you have a choice. You can either accept that ethics and that morality mindlessly, without question, without thinking about it, or you could ask yourself, what is the basis of this ethics, and ultimately, do I agree with it? And he refers to just accepting ethics and morality as taking the easy way out. The reason it's going to be the easy way out is because you don't think about it. You don't put yourself in jeopardy. You don't necessarily challenge those that you're close with or those that have taught you. But it's the easy way out, and the easy way out is a problem, according to Vaughn, for a number of different reasons. One, you lose your freedom. And essentially what you do is you say, well, you live your life according to the beliefs of others. You live your life according to right, wrong, good and bad, as given to you. You don't actually accept this version of right and wrong for yourself. You're just defining your life according to what you've been told. And so you lose your freedom, your ability to fully take charge of your life, fully make these ethics your own, and your life your own. Because how we define good and bad is going to define how we live. He also mentions that if you just accept ethics given to you, you're going to be faced with situations where you can't respond sufficiently. You don't have an answer to what to do in this kind of situation, because situations in real life can be very, very complex, very ambiguous. And if you just kind of accept the rules that you've been taught, you're not going to be able to think deeply. You're not going to have any resources to pull out and use to confront challenging situations. In the same way, there's no room for intellectual growth. You can't grow. You can't become a more ethical person. You can't understand yourself more deeply. You don't have anything more to offer to anybody else because you don't have any wisdom. Okay, and finally, another point here is that the problem with taking the easy way out is that when you confront other people that challenge your views, that have different opinions than you, it's very easy to become bewildered and despondent and discouraged and to say, well, nothing matters, there is no right and wrong, it's all just opinion. And you can give up the ethical quest. And in the same line, Vaughn says relativism is an easy way out. And when you just say, well, it's all just opinion, you're not really thinking deeply. You're just saying, well, it's easier for me to say everybody's right, everybody has their own opinion. But if you want to go deeper, then you've got to ask yourself, well, why is someone right and why is someone else wrong? What makes this right? What makes this wrong? Okay, so those are some very, kind of general points. What is ethics? Why is it important? And what could be the problem with just accepting the moral vision given to you? Then Vaughn also talks about what he calls the ethical landscape. And here he defines ethics in a number of different ways. Or to state it more accurately, there's a number of different ways that ethics can be defined. And he highlights them. Ethics is a branch of philosophy. It is one component of philosophy. It's not all philosophy. Philosophy, I often describe it as generating different portraits of reality, different visions about what life is all about. And different versions or different branches of philosophy include logic. How do we think? What are the rules of thinking? How do we make a good argument? Metaphysics, where you ask the big question, the ultimate questions: what is real? Is there a source of reality? Is there something beyond this life? Ethics, which is really the study of right versus wrong. How do we act? How ought we to live? Aesthetics, which is the study of beauty. We're looking at, well, what makes something beautiful? What is beautiful? Does art and beauty have any important role in society? There's also epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. What can we know? To what degree can we know? Can we know things with absolute certainty or just, very, very likely? All right, now in terms of ethics, he breaks it down a number of different ways. One is what is called descriptive ethics. And in descriptive ethics, really what you're doing is you're just saying, here's what people do. Here's, in fact, how people have defined right versus wrong. Here is how people have lived their lives. But it's not saying this is how people ought to live their lives. It's simply describing how people and different groups of people and different individuals have lived their lives and have defined right and wrong. And this is different than normative ethics. So normative ethics doesn't simply say, here's how people have lived. It says, here's how people ought to live. And a normative ethical view can certainly use and certainly gain insight from a descriptive ethics. But ultimately it's going to say, some people have lived, whether groups or individuals, have lived wrongly. The ways that some individuals and groups have defined right versus wrong is bad. they were incorrect in their definitions. And so there are certain ways that we ought to live, and if there's groups or individuals that don't live this way, then they're bad, they're immoral, they're not right. Okay, kind of following from this, metaethics. So metaethics is a more general, it's kind of the foundation, you might say, of normative ethics. And that's asking, well, what exactly does make something right? Is there a point to being good? Need there be a point? Need you gain some reward? How do you define, right versus wrong? Is happiness and truth and goodness related? So those are some of the big ethical questions. Then applied ethics tends to be more very concrete. It tends to be, okay, you're in a business, so a certain field, a career that you might be in. What makes something right or wrong in these business situations? What makes something right or wrong in this legal situation? What makes something right or wrong in this medical situation? All right, so those are all kind of different ways of focusing, different focuses, you might say, of ethics. And then the last thing I'll talk about, the last thing in the chapter that we're studying, is the elements of ethics. So we talked about, okay, generally, what is ethics? Also, well, how do we define ethics? What are the different ways you can look at it? And then here are elements of ethics. So these are principles that are found in most every ethical system, and they're generally considered to be essential to ethics. One is the preeminence of reasons, in the sense that you just can't say, well, this is right and that's it, and it's right because I say so. It's right because this is what I believe. No, why? If you're going to do ethics, why do you believe this? What are your reasons for believing it? What are your principles? What are your justifications? So it's not enough to simply say, this is what's right. In ethics, you have to give your reasons for that. And if your reasons are ultimately not sufficient, then you should, as a rational person, either give up your belief or continue studying it and figuring out why you think it is right. Okay. 2, the universal perspective. And here the idea is that universal rules or ethical rules and principles should apply universally. You don't make exceptions for no good reason. If it's right not to steal, then you shouldn't steal. And if there's exceptions to that, those exceptions should be defined and they should apply in all situations. You wouldn't just make an exception because you feel like making an exception. And this principle of universality is very tied to the principle of impartiality. And the impartiality principle simply is based on the idea that morally we should treat each other as equals. There's no reason to make an exception with regard to moral rules for non-moral reasons. We shouldn't allow someone who's white to do something and not allow someone who's black to do something simply because of the color of their skin. We shouldn't allow a gay person to do something and not allow a straight person to do it simply because of their sexual identity. We shouldn't allow a man to do something and not allow a woman to do something, assuming that this is an action that can be done equally by both sexes, simply because of the sex, simply because of the gender. So it essentially means that we're talking about morality. If there's a rule or a value that we should follow, then everyone should follow it, assuming that we're in a morally equal situation. Now, you could imagine a situation where people are not morally equal. Rich people and poor people should follow the same rules, but there could be a situation in which somebody who has a ton of money and someone who's starving and whose starvation is a result of an unjust society, there it is more ethically problematic. Perhaps there we're not talking about morally equal people, and it would be right for the poor person to steal and the rich person to not. But again, that would be require a very close and careful inspection of the social situation. And then finally, the last point here is the dominance of moral norms. So moral norms, as I mentioned before, essentially tell you what you ought to do. Here's what you should be doing. And in that way, they take precedence over other norms. So if you're just thinking about, yourself in an egotistic sense, and you say, well, I feel like just vegging out and watching TV and not going to this benefit that I was supposed to go to. So in terms of the norms of just self-preservation or self-interest, that would say, well, you should just stay home. But moral norms tell you what you ought to do, even if it's not in your self-interest. And so they take precedence. They take precedence over norms of prudence, norms of aesthetics, something that just might feel good or look good. And so moral norms, because they say, here's what you ought to do, tend to take precedence. They tend to be the most important in terms of determining our actions. Okay, so that's the video. Essentially kind of introducing you to the study of ethics, the study of morality. And again, we've looked at, how do we define morality? Is it important? What are the different focuses that we can look at in terms of being moral? How does morality fit into a general or broad philosophic study? And then finally, we looked at different elements of ethics. The idea of universality, impartiality, the preeminence of reason, and the dominance of moral norms. All right, that's it.